The backyard twinkled like a slice of small-town Americana, soft golden light strung from oak to maple, their leaves just beginning to flush with summer. Delilah stood on the porch step with a tray of cupcakes balanced in one hand, frosting piped in proud blue and gold swirls, the tops crowned with tiny plastic caps. The scent of freshly mowed grass mingled with charcoal smoke from the grill, where Gerald was half listening to the game on his transistor radio, spatula in hand. Teenagers cackled in a corner near the trampoline, red Solo cups bobbing, their laughter rising and falling like a tide. She scanned the yard. The banner she'd hung earlier in the day still fluttered above the picnic table. Congratulations, Jordan! It had taken her 20 minutes and 3 thumbtacks to get it straight. She'd been proud of the symmetry until Paige arrived. Maybe next time, Paige had said lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. We go with something a little less. Welcome to Cracker Barrel? She'd smiled, not cruelly, but deliberately. And Delilah, who had raised Emmett on spit and sheer will after Frank dropped dead on their kitchen floor 23 years ago, had simply nodded. The banner stayed. But her joy kinked a little. Inside, she'd fussed over the cupcakes, arranging them in concentric circles on her grandmother's glass platter. When Emmett came in to grab a beer from the fridge, she reached for conversation. Remember when Jordan dressed up like a dinosaur for kindergarten graduation? She said, laughing softly. He roared at the principal instead of shaking hands. Emmett gave a tight smile without looking up. Yeah, Paige showed me the video last week. Then he was gone again. The sink hummed with the water she hadn't turned off. Outside, Jordan's friends whooped, the trampoline groaning under their antics. Delilah exhaled, picked up the tray, and walked back out into the warmth. Nancy approached, a glass of sweet tea in one hand, her sunglasses perched on her dyed blonde head like a tiara. Honey, you've outdone yourself, she said, kissing Delilah's cheek. Cupcakes look like something out of Southern Living. Delilah smiled genuinely this time. Thanks, just a little something homemade. They stood together for a minute, watching the crowd. Paige in a crisp linen dress, Emmett trailing after her like a shadow. Gerald now joined by a few dads at the grill, exchanging dad jokes over sizzle and smoke. And Jordan, tall now, taller than Emmett, with his mother's confidence and something else Delilah couldn't quite name. He was laughing with a friend, gesturing wide, full of the kind of easy energy that made people draw close. Then Delilah heard it. She's not even a real grandma, Jordan said, a crooked grin stretching his face. The friend laughed. What, seriously? Paige was nearby. She didn't correct him. She chuckled, low and approving, sipping her lemonade. Delilah froze, the tray of cupcakes suddenly too heavy in her hands. The sound of her heartbeat thundered in her ears, though she still stood, still smiled. A small laugh escaped her lips, automatic and hollow. Not a real grandma. Her body remembered the sleepless nights when Emmett was a baby, the way she'd cried silently with him so as not to wake Frank, the birthday parties with store-bought cake when the budget was tight, how she'd braided Paige's hair before their wedding, gently, like threading a needle through silence. She turned away before the tears could climb. At the far end of the yard, the microphone was being tested. Someone tapped it. Jordan waved off his friend and stepped up. The crowd hushed. Hey, everyone, he said. Thanks for coming. His voice cracked slightly and someone whooped. It means a lot to see all your faces here tonight. Honestly, I'm just grateful. For the support, for my parents, Mom, Dad, I love you. You've always believed in me. And to everyone who's had my back along the way. His eyes briefly swept the yard. They didn't pause on Delilah. Thank you. The crowd clapped. A few cheers. Emmett patted Jordan's shoulder. Paige dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Delilah set the cupcakes on the table. Her hands were shaking. But her face? Oh, it was the same expression she'd worn when the bank called her after Frank's death, when Emmett ran away for 2 nights in 10th grade, when the doctor said, "We'll monitor the lump, but we need a biopsy." She moved through the party as if underwater, offering cupcakes to kids who barely looked up, nodding as Nancy told a story about her dog and a squirrel. She smiled when Gerald complimented the chicken skewers. But everything sounded tinny, hollow, like a world she could no longer touch. Later, long after the sky had bruised to purple and the lights flickered like forgotten stars, Delilah sat alone on the porch steps, her good shoes dusty, her hands empty. From the yard came the thud of music, laughter, and youth. Not a real grandma. She whispered it, testing the phrase like a jagged tooth. The swing creaked beside her. Gerald sat down, offering her a fresh glass of iced tea. "Hell of a night," he said. She nodded, sipped, swallowed. Gerald glanced at her, then away. "You okay, Dee?" Delilah turned her gaze to the banner, still waving above the table, proud and uneven. "Fine," she said. "It's just a party." But her heart told a different story. It wasn't the way Paige slammed doors or yelled across rooms. No, Paige operated with the finesse of a scalpel, all smooth edges and sugary tones. Her cruelty was pressed beneath layers of civility, masked as manners. She never cursed, never raised her voice. Her warfare was elegant, quiet, and so finely tuned it often took hours or days for Delilah to realize she'd been wounded. It had begun early. Delilah still remembered the first Christmas after Emmett married Paige. The house smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg, and Delilah had spent days preparing a meal: glazed ham, green bean casserole, sweet potatoes, rolls from scratch. Paige had brought a quiche from a local bakery, then commented, smiling sweetly, "Isn't it wild how heavy traditional food can feel? We're trying to be more plant-based." Delilah had nodded and offered her a second serving. But no one touched the casserole after Paige's remark. The birthdays came next. One year, Delilah arrived with a handmade quilt for Jordan, stitched with patches from Emmett's old sports jerseys. Paige smiled with her eyes slightly too wide, thanked her politely, then handed Jordan his real gift, an iPad. The quilt stayed in its box all afternoon. When Delilah asked about it months later, Paige blinked and said, "Oh, I think it's in the garage with the moving stuff." Over time, Paige had developed a way of involving Delilah only in the margins. She would ask her to help with holidays, but never to host, suggesting instead that they keep things minimal for simplicity. On Thanksgiving, Delilah was tasked with making the gravy and cleaning the vegetables. When she arrived with a pie, Paige would say things like, "Oh no, we already have dessert, but thank you, we'll save this for later." Every encounter followed the same formula. Paige would smile too tightly, speak too kindly, and place invisible tape over Delilah's mouth. And always Emmett would defend her. "She doesn't mean anything by it, Ma," he said once, after Delilah confided in him that she felt excluded. "She said I shouldn't sit next to Jordan during presents," Delilah had said quietly, "that she wanted it to be just the parents." Emmett had shrugged. "She just wants to keep things organized. Don't take it so personally." But how could she not, when every gathering felt like a pageant where she was cast as a background extra? At one 4th of July barbecue, Delilah arrived early to help set up. She had brought deviled eggs in a crystal dish and wore her best blouse, white with tiny violets along the collar. Paige greeted her with a smile, arms full of eco-friendly napkins. "Oh, perfect, Delilah," she said. "Could you set those on the side table? Maybe just not too close to the veggie platter? I'm trying to keep things color-coordinated." Delilah obeyed. Later, she overheard Paige telling her cousin, "She's sweet, but she's more like a sitter with stories than a real grandparent." The words slipped into Delilah's ears like ice water, more like a sitter. That night, Delilah had gone home and stood in the kitchen, staring at the photo of baby Emmett on the fridge. She pressed a hand to the counter to steady herself, unsure why she felt like she'd just lost something she never had a name for. She never told Emmett. What would be the point? Instead, she kept showing up. She smiled. She brought cupcakes, washed dishes, picked up Jordan from soccer when Paige just couldn't get away. She made herself indispensable in all the ways that didn't earn acknowledgement. Until the day she stumbled across the truth. It was late on a Wednesday afternoon. Delilah had picked up Jordan from school and brought him home. Paige had a client crisis, and Emmett was still at work. Jordan had vanished to his room, thumping up the stairs with barely a greeting, leaving Delilah alone in the kitchen. She'd been unloading groceries onto the granite counter when Paige's phone buzzed beside a bowl of oranges. Delilah ignored it at first, but it buzzed again and again. She reached for it instinctively, intending to silence the notifications, maybe check if it was something urgent. Paige had given her the unlock code once, months ago, when she needed to access Jordan's class schedule. Her fingers moved automatically. 0625. The messages opened on the screen like a blooming wound. A group chat titled House of Sass. Paige, Emmett, Jordan. A few names Delilah didn't recognize. The latest message came from Paige. Guess who iced cupcakes again like it's 1952? Should I clap and weep or just give her a rotary phone? Laughing emojis. Then Emmett. At least it wasn't another story about how she held down the fort after Dad. One more Wuntu widow monologue and I'll fake a stroke. Jordan had added a meme. An old lady from a cartoon vacuuming furiously with the caption, "When the sitter thinks she runs the place." Delilah's breath hitched. She sat down, phone still glowing in her hand. The house felt suddenly alien. The quartz countertop, the stainless steel appliances, the designer bar stools, none of it had ever belonged to her. But now, it all rejected her outright. These weren't strangers being cruel behind a screen. These were her people, her son, her grandson. They weren't defending Paige, they were joining her. She placed the phone back gently, like it was something that could break her if she touched it wrong. When Paige returned an hour later, Delilah was back at the counter, slicing strawberries for Jordan's snack. She smiled, said nothing. Paige didn't notice anything different. That night, back in her own house, Delilah didn't cry. She stood by the kitchen sink, the one Frank had installed all those years ago, and stared out into the dark. The wind moved through the trees like an old hymn. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was unraveling, quietly, silently, one thread at a time. The sewing room was the only space in the house that still whispered Frank's name. Dust floated in golden strands through the afternoon light, catching on spools of thread, the old Singer machine, the pincushion shaped like a tomato. Along the far wall, tucked inside a garment bag yellowed with age, hung the flannel shirt she had kept since the week he died. Delilah touched it now with 2 fingers, like she might wake something in its faded plaid. She hadn't cried. Not when she read the messages, not when Paige laughed at her cupcakes, not even when Jordan called her a sitter. But now, under the low hum of the window fan and the scent of mothballs and lavender, her knees buckled like twigs under snow, and she sank into the padded chair beside the machine. For a long time, she sat without movement, the flannel crushed to her chest, her face hollow with silence. This wasn't the first time she'd been discarded. This ache, the ache of invisibility, had a lineage. Delilah's childhood was a museum of control, a pristine, polished house on the outskirts of Altoona. Her mother, Lorraine, kept white slipcovers on the furniture year-round. Every towel had its precise fold. Every meal was symmetrical. The house gleamed, but it never breathed. Emotion was something you kept in the pantry with the vinegar. Her mother never yelled. She didn't need to. One arched brow, one glance at a wrinkled bedsheet or a crooked painting, and you'd dissolve into apology. Once, at age 7, Delilah spilled cranberry juice on the dining room rug during Thanksgiving. Lorraine didn't scream. She calmly removed the glass from her daughter's hand, took her by the wrist, and said, "Clean people don't belong in dirty scenes." Delilah spent the rest of dinner in her room, her dress shoes still tight on her feet, her appetite replaced with shame. Love in that house came dressed as duty. You earned your place by being quiet, by being useful, by not needing much. Delilah had mastered it. She learned to iron creases so sharp they could cut, learned to listen without speaking, to shrink herself just enough not to be noticed, but not enough to seem pitiful. There was an art to being almost invisible, to being decor. Her mother didn't hug her on birthdays. She complimented her posture. "You'll be graceful like a dancer if you keep your spine straight." That was the closest she ever got to saying she was proud. Delilah left home with nothing but a suitcase and an iron will. She met Frank in a grocery store, a bag of potatoes splitting open between them. He had the kind of laugh that cracked through tension like sunlight through glass. When he offered to help her carry her groceries, she had said yes before thinking. It startled her, how easy it was to want kindness. Frank never made her feel small. He brought warmth to their cold marriage bed with jokes and calloused hands. He wasn't perfect. He forgot anniversaries, left socks around like breadcrumbs. But he saw her. The way he'd place a hand on the small of her back when she was tired. The way he'd murmur, "Let it go, Dee," when her shoulders tensed. He was the first person who didn't measure her worth by what she produced. When he died, sudden, the kind of sudden that doesn't give you time to say goodbye, Delilah folded inward again. Not because she wanted to, because she didn't know how else to survive. Grief was not a thing she'd been taught to speak. Emmett had been only 12, and Delilah, left alone, had slipped back into the only thing she knew, being necessary. She became 2 parents, 3 jobs, 4 casseroles deep on any given day. Her love turned into duty because that was how she'd been trained to give it. But now, here, in this room, with Frank's shirt held to her chest and the ache of 3 generations carved deep in her ribs, she began to see the pattern. Paige was not just Paige. Paige was the echo of Lorraine. Perfection without warmth, applause without affection. Delilah had married her mother by proxy into the next generation, and Emmett, oh, Emmett, had learned to accommodate that same chill. Not because he was cruel, but because he was born into a blueprint where women carried things alone and men applauded from a distance. Delilah had never told him he was allowed to need her emotionally. She had baked instead, cleaned, bought the birthday gift so Paige could sign the card. And now, Paige wore the role of matriarch with sharp elegance, while Delilah stood off stage, holding the hem of someone else's spotlight. It wasn't just Paige who erased her, it was the life Delilah had accepted. She thought about Jordan, about that damn sentence. She's not even a real grandma. The words weren't daggers, they were mirrors. And Delilah finally was looking into one. She had spent decades performing usefulness, mistaking it for love. She had passed down silence like an heirloom. What had she taught her son, her grandson, about what love looked like? About what a woman deserved? She pressed her face into the flannel and wept. Not loud, not theatrical. The way a dam leaks before it cracks, soft, steady, years behind schedule. She cried for the little girl in the cranberry-stained dress. She cried for the young mother with an empty bed and bills she couldn't pay. She cried for the woman who made perfect cupcakes while her family laughed behind her back. And when the tears slowed, Delilah sat up straighter. Her hands, though wrinkled and dry, looked stronger than they had in years. This inheritance, the cold house, the silent grief, the role of helper, not heart, would end with her. Delilah first noticed it on a Thursday evening, the kind that hovered in the soft breath between spring and summer. She was scrolling through Facebook, one of her quiet rituals after dishes were done, and the house was still. Jordan had posted a photo of himself in front of a local community center, smiling with 2 classmates, their caps thrown haphazardly in the air. The caption read, "Grateful to the ones who showed up for me. Past, present, future." Delilah's fingers hovered, then tapped a comment. "So proud of you, sweetheart. Love you always. Grandma D." It wasn't much. It was careful. Light, even. The kind of thing that wouldn't draw Paige's raised eyebrow or Emmett's silence. She refreshed the page. The comment had vanished. She blinked, hit refresh again, gone. A beat later, the whole post disappeared, vanished from his timeline as if it never existed. Delilah sat back in her chair. Her tea, now cold, sat untouched beside her. She didn't cry. She didn't even frown. But something settled deeper into her bones. A hollowing out that had begun long ago and was now nearly complete. The shift had been slow, like tide carving stone. When Jordan was small, he used to curl into her side during thunderstorms. He'd burrow under the old patchwork quilt she kept on the couch, one hand clutching her wrist, whispering, "It's too loud, Grandma. Make it go away." And she would sing softly, rub circles on his back, whisper stories of storms made of sugar and rain clouds shaped like balloons. Once, at age 6, he'd drawn a crayon picture of her holding him in the rain, lightning zigzagging behind them. "Grandma D is safe" was scrawled in crooked handwriting at the top. But now, at 17, he barely glanced her way when she came over. If she sat on the same couch, he shifted. If she asked about his day, he gave one-word answers, his eyes always on his phone. During his graduation party, he hadn't so much as hugged her. When she reached for his arm to take a photo, he stepped slightly to the side. And the language. He was starting to speak like Paige. "It's fine," he'd said when she offered to help with his college packing list. "Mom's got it streamlined." Or, "Don't worry about that, Grandma. You don't really need to get involved in all the details." It wasn't cruel, but it erased her. The same way Paige erased her, softly, sweetly, with the efficiency of someone sweeping dust from a shelf. Delilah had always believed that love, when consistently given, would root itself. That the hours spent folding tiny clothes, packing lunches, remembering Jordan's favorite bedtime books, those things would bind them. But Paige was winning, not with drama, but with persistence, with strategy, with image. The last time Delilah had picked Jordan up from school, he'd kept his earbuds in the entire ride. She had asked about a girl she'd seen him with at the party, and he'd mumbled, "It's complicated," without elaborating. At a red light, she'd looked at him, the slouch of his shoulders, the new jawline, the hair that kept falling into his eyes, and remembered the boy who once believed her pancakes cured bad dreams. Now he couldn't sit beside her without checking his phone. She started journaling. Not with any grand intent, just pages of memory, moments no one asked her to share anymore. She wrote about the time she and Frank had made snow angels on a dare, laughing like teenagers. About Emmett's first scraped knee and how he hadn't cried. Just looked up at her with startled eyes until she pretended to cry too, so he'd feel safe. About Jordan's toddler laugh, bright and bird-like, and the way he used to call her Grandmama Delight. The pages piled up in a blue spiral notebook, its cover faded at the corners. She hid it beneath the sewing patterns in her desk drawer. It was the only place where her history wasn't erased. One afternoon, while babysitting, she lingered in the kitchen to reheat soup. Jordan was upstairs. The house was quiet, too quiet. She stood by the stove, humming softly to herself, speaking out loud without meaning to. "I still remember when you'd spin in circles to make him laugh," she whispered to the ghost of Frank, her voice barely above a breath. "He had your eyes then, not now. Now they're hers." She turned toward the fridge, looking for crackers. And that's when she saw it, mounted high in the corner, subtle enough to blend in with the molding. A sleek, small black device, a lens, a light, a blinking red dot. Delilah's breath caught. She stepped closer, squinting. It wasn't just a camera. It was a microphone, too, tucked neatly into the upper trim near the ceiling, its presence deliberate, cold. When Paige returned, Delilah asked carefully, "What's the little black thing in the kitchen, by the window?" "Oh, that," Paige said breezily, setting down her keys. "It's a safety monitor, just something to make sure everything's fine when we're out. You know how things are these days. Stranger danger, emergencies. It's standard in a lot of smart homes now." Delilah nodded. But inside her chest something twisted. She remembered every word she'd said aloud in that kitchen, remembered humming to herself, talking to Frank, sometimes muttering old memories, half-formed thoughts about being unwelcome, unseen. And now she realized they hadn't needed to ask her anything. Paige hadn't needed to interrogate or accuse. The house listened for her. Her solitude had been invaded. Her grief wasn't private. It was recorded, reviewed, possibly laughed at, again. She walked to her car that evening with a strange clarity. It was like watching rain fall on a windshield after too long inside. Every drop made the world outside just a little sharper. Jordan didn't hate her. That would have been easier. He didn't feel anything. He had absorbed the tone around him. The way Delilah's role was minimized, framed in faint mockery. He mirrored Paige because Paige controlled the atmosphere. He laughed when she laughed, ignored when she ignored, erased what she erased. Children didn't just grow, they echoed. And Delilah, for all her silent love, for all her labor and lace and loyalty, was now just background noise in a house that edited her out. The next day, she bought a second journal, a smaller one, red leather cover. She didn't know what she'd fill it with yet, only that it would be her voice, unrecorded, unreviewed, just hers. Delilah waited until after dinner, the sky still lavender at the edges. Emmett was helping Jordan load chairs into the garage after another family dinner where Paige had praised the salad she bought from Whole Foods and corrected Delilah's recollection of a story before she could finish it. She caught Emmett near the back porch light, flickering from a faulty bulb no one had fixed. His shoulders were relaxed in that post-meal way, a beer dangling from one hand. It reminded her of Frank at this age, tired, but gentle. "Do you have a minute?" she asked, voice careful. "Sure," he said, stepping to the side. "Everything okay?" She nodded slowly. I want to talk. About Paige. About Jordan." Immediately the tension pinched at his mouth. "Mom," he said. tone already defensive. No, she cut in softly. I'm not here to accuse anyone. Something feels wrong. I feel like I'm slowly being erased. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You're overthinking again. You always do this. She blinked. Do what? Mom, he said, softening the way one does before delivering a blow wrapped in care. You've always been a little emotional. Paige just has better boundaries, that's all. She doesn't mean anything by it. Delilah's hands tensed around each other. Boundaries? Is that what you call it when someone calls the person who raised you a sitter with stories? He flinched, barely. You weren't supposed to hear that. But I did. Silence settled between them. Crickets chirped faintly in the distance. I'm not trying to drive a wedge, Emmett, she said, steady now. I'm trying to tell you something is off. I know you see it, even if you've taught yourself not to. He looked down at his feet, then back up. Maybe you should talk to someone, he said. A counselor, someone neutral. You've been carrying a lot from your past, and sometimes it clouds things. Delilah's breath caught. Clouds things, she echoed. You think this is just me, being dramatic. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Her voice was firmer now. She's not drawing lines, Emmett. She's building walls. And she's stacking the bricks with your silence. You think that's neutrality, but it's not. It's complicity. Emmett's face stiffened. He looked at the ground again, jaw tightening. I'm not going to stand here and listen to you tear apart my wife. I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking you to see me. I do see you, he said, too quickly. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Harder, as if the heaviness hadn't already become her daily companion. He started to step away, but she reached out, touched his arm. Emmett, do you remember when you were 7 and you hid in the laundry basket because you didn't want to go to school without your lucky sock? Who found you? Who ironed your socks after that every single morning for a year? He smiled reluctantly. You did. I didn't just iron socks. I built your world, brick by brick. Love isn't performative, Emmett. It's quiet. It's in the background. It's cupcakes and stories and late-night rides when your baby won't stop crying. He didn't respond, just nodded and walked inside, shoulders heavy with avoidance. That night, Delilah sat with Nancy on her back porch, the two of them sharing a slice of peach pie from a paper plate. The wind tugged gently at the hem of the tablecloth. He's not going to listen, Delilah said. Not until it's too late. Nancy sipped from her wine glass. Then stop asking for a seat at a table you built. Make your own damn table. Delilah looked at her. You keep waiting for them to come around, Nancy continued. But what if they don't? You're the one holding all the glue, Dee. Reclaim your space. Delilah nodded, slowly, letting the idea move through her like warm tea. A few days later, she ran into Gerald while walking to the post office. She shared just enough of what had happened. The cropped-out feelings, the microphone, the steady retreat of her place in the family. Gerald listened without interrupting. You have rights, he said simply. If they're recording you in the house without your consent, that's a violation in this state. Doesn't matter who owns the home. That's not just unkind, it's unlawful. Delilah was quiet a moment. I'm not trying to sue them. Then don't, he said, eyes kind. But don't confuse legality with morality. What they're doing is more than disrespect. It's erasure. People don't think they're monsters until someone shows them a mirror. Later that week, Paige sent the family photos from the graduation party. A glossy group shot, everyone smiling. Delilah opened the file. She wasn't in it. She had stood at the far left, next to Gerald. She remembered the moment. Remembered brushing Jordan's tassel out of his eyes, laughing at something Nancy had said. But in the final print, cropped, cleanly, artfully, she was gone. Only the edge of her floral sleeve remained, half a sunflower visible before the frame ended. She stared at the image for a long time. Then she pressed print. The cropped photo hung on her fridge now, a reminder. Not of what she lost, but of what she would no longer wait to be given. The afternoon sun lay golden across the grass, softening the edges of everything. The chairs aligned under the canopy, the glossy blue and gold balloons, the fluttering banner that still read, "Congratulations, Jordan," with a slight sag in the middle. Delilah stood near the punch table, a plastic cup in hand, untouched, condensation soaking her fingers. Her dress, navy with white petals, clung damp at the back. The lawn buzzed with laughter, forks tapping on paper plates, the off-key hum of someone's Bluetooth speaker playing Walking on Sunshine. Jordan stood near the patio steps, holding a cordless mic with the same casual ease as a soda can. He was tall, freshly shaven, his tie crooked in the way that made teenage boys look charming instead of unkempt. Around him, guests clapped as he raised a hand, waiting for quiet. Delilah smiled, small and practiced. Maybe, she thought, maybe this is when it shifts. "Hey everyone," Jordan began. "First off, thanks for being here. Seriously, it means a lot. Graduating feels huge, and I wouldn't have made it here without some pretty amazing people in my life." Scattered applause. He grinned. "Biggest thanks to my mom and dad. Mom, you are an organization ninja, and Dad, even though you hate mornings, you drove me to practices without ever complaining. You both, yeah, you're everything." People laughed warmly. Paige dabbed theatrically at her eyes, and Emmett squeezed her shoulder. Jordan continued. "To my friends, my second family, you've kept me sane. And to everyone else who supported me, even the people who've just been, like, background cheerleaders, thank you." Delilah's hands tightened slightly on her cup. No name, no nod. Not even a vague grandparent reference. Just background cheerleaders. Behind her, Nancy sucked in a breath. Gerald shifted on his feet. No one said anything. The moment was so brief it could have passed unnoticed. But then Paige, in her linen sundress and perfectly staged lipstick, laughed louder than necessary and said, "Delilah's kind of like a family historian. She knows all the stories, even the ones we didn't want to hear. But you know, not really part of the new team." A ripple of polite laughter, uneasy chuckles. One woman gave a quiet "oh" and sipped her wine. Delilah didn't move. Her punch stayed still, reflecting the pale June sun like a shallow pond. Her face remained a mask, neutral, attentive, untouched. Inside, something gave. She could feel it, like a shelf giving way in her chest, jars crashing to the floor, everything sticky and ruined beneath. Paige had turned her into a museum piece, a relic, something vaguely respected, but no longer belonging. Behind her, Jordan muttered something to his friend, not meant for the microphone but caught by those nearby. "She's not even a real grandma, just here for show." The words hit with no warning, no breath to brace against. Delilah blinked once. Her throat stayed steady, her eyes dry. But the world blurred anyway, not from tears, but from the sudden collapse of all her illusions. This wasn't confusion anymore. This wasn't her misreading the signs. This was a fracture, public, clean, irreversible. Nancy stepped closer, brushing Delilah's arm. The gesture was quiet, an anchor. Delilah didn't look at her, couldn't. The party moved on. Jordan handed the mic to someone else. Music swelled again, and people filtered back to their conversations, their drinks, their small, polite gossip. Delilah stepped away from the crowd, past the buffet table, into the shaded corner near the side gate. The sounds became distant there. Laughter dulled by leaves, the smell of charcoal mingling with cut grass. She leaned against the fence and exhaled slowly, afraid that if she didn't regulate each breath, she might shatter. This was what it meant to disappear in plain sight. Paige had succeeded, not with cruelty, but with polish. Every insult wrapped in lace, every exclusion coated in charm. Delilah had been turned into a prop, something pleasant to photograph, easy to ignore, and even easier to crop out. A few minutes later, Nancy found her. Her face was unusually pale, and she held a crumpled piece of paper in one hand. "Dee," she said softly, glancing around before stepping closer. "I need to show you something." Delilah straightened. "I was looking for more tablecloth clips in the supply bin," Nancy said, voice tight. "And I found this tucked under Paige's clipboard." She handed it over. Legal-sized, letterhead from a local estate firm. Delilah's eyes scanned the first few lines. Grant of limited estate rights, authorization of executor access for property and medical directives, Delilah Ann Brewer. She froze. Nancy continued. "It's pre-signed by Paige, drafted with language suggesting you've already agreed to transfer partial decision-making to her for emergencies, health care, finances, not full control, just enough to lock you out of your own autonomy." "But I never—" Delilah stopped herself. She hadn't signed anything, not yet, but there'd been small papers, notes left on the counter to initial. Oh, just confirming Jordan's school forms. Just a quick insurance update, Dee. Don't worry. Paige always smiled. Nancy nodded grimly. It's predated 2 weeks ago. Delilah stared at the document, her own name printed neatly under Party of Consideration. She thought of the voice monitoring device, of being cropped from a family photo, of being told she was emotional, that she needed counseling, of watching Jordan, her boy once terrified of storms, now use her name like an afterthought. This was not absence. This was architecture, every insult, every omission, every kind laugh concealing a blade. Delilah folded the paper carefully, not out of respect, but out of clarity. Nancy placed a hand on her back. You okay? Delilah didn't speak for a moment, then quietly, I think I finally understand. Nancy waited. This wasn't a drift, Delilah said. It was a plan. I was just too loyal to imagine it. And the scariest part? They thought they were helping. Paige probably believed she was managing the aging matriarch. Emmett likely saw it as safeguarding. Jordan? Jordan had no reason to question the script they'd handed him. It was easier than loving someone inconvenient. Delilah looked toward the canopy. The banner flapped listlessly. Laughter swelled again. But now every face looked different. Because now, she knew exactly who she was not. And that was the beginning of remembering who she'd always been. Delilah moved through her kitchen with practiced grace, fingers dusted in flour, the scent of banana bread warming the walls. The old oven ticked softly behind her. But the baking timer wasn't just for bread anymore. It was her cue to rotate a phone angled behind the paper towel holder. Its screen dimmed, recording audio like a second heartbeat beneath the surface. She had started small. The morning after the graduation party, Delilah sat at her dining room table, the estate document Nancy had found folded before her, a yellow legal pad at her elbow. At the top, she wrote in neat, steady script, June 10th, found draft estate control document, not signed, created without consent. Underneath, she began listing other moments, subtle dismissals, comments framed as jokes, decisions made without her voice. She transcribed from memory the message Paige had once sent through Emmett's phone. Can Dee pick up Jordan at 4? We'll be tied up with the real stuff. The real stuff. The phrase clung to her ribs like a bruise. Delilah didn't cry. She got to work. She searched her old emails, her phone's history, cloud backups. She took screenshots, one by one, of text threads where Paige had redirected family questions to herself, minimizing Delilah's role in decision-making. She documented every instance of her own name being left out, talked over, or redefined. Then came the audio. The voice monitoring device had taught her one thing. If they could listen to her, she could listen to them. She placed an old cell phone beneath the fruit bowl at Paige's house, left it recording quietly while she washed dishes or tidied up. She kept another in her purse, audio app open beneath her crossword puzzle. She didn't want vengeance. She wanted clarity. She needed truth, unfiltered, to prove, if only to herself, that this wasn't imagined. Nancy brought her a flash drive disguised as a keychain and helped her transfer everything onto it. And still, Delilah moved in patterns Paige would never suspect. She tucked handwritten notes inside old recipe books, pages on lemon bars or meatloaf, folded tight between butter stains and margin scribbles from 1987. She labeled them only with numbers and dates. She used the index cards from her sewing kit, wrote entries in red thread between fabric swatches. In her spice rack, a small bag of lavender contained a SIM card. She learned quickly, efficiently. Every baking timer was a signal now, not for doneness, but to rotate, save, move, conceal. They had wanted her to play small, quiet, compliant. But Delilah was a woman who had once memorized Frank's social security number while in labor because they needed it for the hospital form. She was a woman who'd balanced checkbooks by candlelight, packed lunches while reciting spelling words, held her son together after his father died without a single therapist in sight. Erasure was not something she would surrender to. One night, she sat in her sewing room, a pile of thread and documents around her, and her gaze drifted upward to the photo of Frank above the fabric rack. He wore a flannel shirt and a smirk, leaning against their first car. And like a whisper, she heard it again, his voice, rough and steady, from that final morning. She had been brushing crumbs from his shirt, fussing over whether he'd taken his cholesterol pill, and he'd chuckled, weak but wry. Don't fade, Dee. Don't let them erase you. At the time, she thought he meant death. Now she realized he'd meant this. Nancy didn't just offer comfort this time. She brought an answer. Her name's Iris, she said, placing a business card in Delilah's palm. She's my daughter-in-law's cousin. Real sharp. Family law and elder rights. You don't owe them silence. Delilah nodded, not with fire, but with purpose. The next week, Iris came to Delilah's house. Young, observant, a silver laptop already open before the kettle finished whistling. You're not just preparing to protect yourself, Iris said, eyes scanning the files Delilah had arranged on the table. You're rewriting your own place in their narrative. Together, they began drafting a living trust, one that secured Delilah's financial autonomy, ensured her assets couldn't be reassigned or interpreted by anyone else without her consent. They rewrote the power of attorney documents, removing the default names, inserting a third-party fiduciary instead. Iris showed her how to file revocation papers for anything she might have signed under assumption or pressure. You don't need to confront them with this. Not yet, Iris advised. Just hold your position, quietly, legally. You don't owe them forewarning. Delilah agreed. She wasn't interested in dramatics. She wanted preservation. She wanted to stitch herself back into the story they tried to write her out of. So each morning, she brewed her tea, straightened her recipe cards, recorded small memories in her red leather journal, and then returned to gathering the threads. Every insult, every omission, every gesture of performance over presence. The woman they thought they were phasing out was writing her own archive. And she wasn't fading. It began with a casserole. Delilah placed the dish gently on Paige's granite counter, cheddar and chive, her usual offering, then pulled out the manila folder from her tote. Paige was arranging silverware, humming, her gold hoops catching the morning light. Can we talk? Delilah asked. Paige glanced up, all performance. Of course, she said with a smile that flickered at the corners. What's up? Delilah slid the folder across the counter. You might want to sit. A pause. Paige didn't sit. She opened the folder, her fingers still manicured in ballet pink. Her eyes scanned the pages, copies of estate documents, emails, app data logs, screenshots of texts, all organized, tabbed, time-stamped. By the time Emmett walked in, his tie half-tied, Paige was already closing the folder with a slow exhale. What's going on? He asked, blinking at the silence. Delilah turned toward him. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to correct the story you've both been telling yourselves. Mom? Don't, she interrupted, not sharply, but with the edge of long-withheld steel. I gave you chances to hear me softly. Now you'll hear the rest. Paige crossed her arms. You want to play victim? Fine. But don't expect applause. You've always made everything about you. It's exhausting. Delilah's lips pressed together. What's exhausting is being rewritten in your family like a character that never mattered. Emmett stepped in. This is embarrassing. You're blowing up the family over feelings. You think because you baked some cupcakes and told some bedtime stories, you get to control everything? I never wanted control, Delilah replied, her voice steady. I wanted truth. I wanted dignity. You gave me neither. Paige gave a short laugh, biting. So this is about the estate? About money? Delilah turned to her, eyes narrowing. No, it's about what you did with it. Drafting authority behind my back, installing surveillance, mocking me in group texts while smiling across the dinner table. This wasn't ignorance. It was architecture. Paige's mouth opened, closed. Her eyes darted to Emmett for support. He lifted his hands. Can we all just breathe? Figure this out like adults? Gerald, who'd been quiet in the doorway, stepped in now. Figuring it out starts with acknowledgement, he said. Delilah's not imagining this. I've seen the paperwork. I've seen the treatment. You don't get to gaslight someone just because she's quieter than you are. The room fell silent. Delilah picked up the folder again, held it like scripture. I have updated my estate. My assets are protected. I've filed revocations, restructured my trust, and assigned third-party control. You're no longer entitled to anything unless I choose to give it. Emmett looked stricken, like a man watching a house burn he hadn't realized was his. And I have no intention of keeping secrets anymore, she added. I won't pretend we're a family that honors each other when what you really honor is performance and convenience. Paige moved toward the counter, fingers splaying across the cool marble. You're making this ugly, she whispered, voice hardening. You think this makes you strong? No, it makes you petty. Delilah tilted her head. No, it makes me visible. She turned toward the door, the moment done. Gerald followed behind her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder as they stepped into the light. It wasn't triumphant, it wasn't clean, but it was real. Later that evening, as Delilah sat in her sewing room sorting old fabric into boxes labeled Keep and No Longer Mine, her laptop pinged. She opened it. A new email from Jordan M. Brewer. Subject for you. Attachment. The woman who always waited, college essay.docs, no message, just the file. Delilah hesitated, then clicked. The screen filled with words. It began plainly, almost dispassionately. My grandmother, Delilah Ann Brewer, is not a famous woman. She's not rich. She doesn't run a company or post quotes online. But I've seen her more clearly than I've seen anyone else. She's the woman who always waited. For school buses, for rides home, for calls that didn't come. She waited with casseroles, with stitched hems, with folded hands that never demanded anything. I didn't notice how much she held until I watched everyone else let her go. Delilah read each line like it was stitched in breath. Her hands trembled, not with rage or pain, but release. I said something cruel once. I said she wasn't a real grandma. I said she was just for show. I didn't know the weight of what I was echoing. I just didn't want to be the one left out. But she wasn't invisible. We just learned how to stop looking. This essay is for her, because she didn't fade. Delilah exhaled. The page blurred again, not from grief, but from something else. Something closer to repair. The conference room was cold, lit by two bright fluorescents that buzzed faintly overhead. The walls were bare except for a clock that ticked too loudly, and a landscape print that might as well have been painted in gray. A long rectangular table stretched through the center of the room, cluttered with thick paper stacks, water bottles, and the silent weight of withheld truth. Delilah sat at the end, composed in a navy blazer and a pearl brooch that had belonged to her mother, one of the few remnants she'd reclaimed on her own terms. To her left sat Iris, calm and unreadable, her laptop open and already humming. Across from them, Emmett fidgeted with the label on his water bottle, and Paige wore her mask-like armor, crisp blouse, practiced posture, legs crossed just so. Between them sat the third-party mediator, a soft-voiced woman named Karen, who had introduced herself with firm handshakes and no small talk. The file in front of Iris had a single photo clipped to the top, Jordan's essay, printed in clean serif font. The woman who always waited. It wasn't part of the legal packet, but it sat there deliberately, in quiet defiance of what everyone had tried to ignore. The session began with formalities. Property lines, financial accounts, medical directives, outdated trusts. Paige objected to nearly every clause Iris read aloud. That wasn't the intent, Paige said smoothly. We only drafted those because we were concerned for Delilah's well-being. She's been vulnerable lately. She's been disrespected, Iris countered. There's a difference. Emmett sat in silence. Karen turned to Delilah. You've requested this mediation to clarify control over your estate and residence. You also claim there was manipulation involved. You may speak now. Delilah folded her hands and inhaled, then stood not out of dramatics, but because her voice needed a body behind it. I've spent most of my life being helpful, she began evenly. Quiet, not a problem. I gave and gave because I believed that's what love looked like. But what I've learned in this last year is that being helpful isn't the same as being respected. She glanced briefly at Emmett, then back at Karen. You wanted a mascot, she said clearly, turning now to Paige. But I built the field. The room went still. You wanted cupcakes and stories, but not opinions or presents? You wanted a soft seat cushion, not a person. And when I no longer fit that version of myself, you edited me out. Paige rolled her eyes. We didn't edit you. We protected you. By mocking me in messages? By hiding documents in party supply bins? Delilah asked, voice still steady. By installing a voice monitoring app in your kitchen and calling it safety? Karen raised a hand. Let's keep this productive. But Paige interrupted, her control slipping. You've always been dramatic, Delilah. You make everything about you. You knew we were struggling, and instead of helping, you hoarded your space like some martyr. Delilah tilted her head. Is that why you began preparing to move me into assisted living without my knowledge? Silence. Karen blinked. Is that accurate? Paige flushed. It wasn't final, just exploratory. Emmett and I discussed it. We were thinking long-term care. I'm not a pet, Delilah snapped, the calm finally breaking. You don't get to discuss my future like it's a house remodel. Emmett finally spoke. We didn't mean to push you out, Mom. We were just overwhelmed. Paige said we needed structure. And you agreed, Delilah said. Because structure is easier than empathy. Karen cleared her throat, then looked to Iris. Legal position? Iris handed over a printed sheet. Delilah Brewer has full ownership of the property in question. No official documents transferring rights were ever executed with full consent. She has now created a revised trust and updated her power of attorney. All past drafts are to be voided. And the house? Karen asked. Delilah has reclaimed full control of the residence. Miss Paige Brewer and Mr. Emmett Brewer are required to vacate the property within 45 days. Paige's jaw fell open. You can't be serious. Where are we supposed to go? That's not Delilah's concern, Iris said without flinching. It never should have been. Karen nodded, making a note. So ordered. All documents previously associated with Delilah's estate are hereby nullified. Delilah retains full financial autonomy, housing rights, and medical decision authority. Paige turned toward Emmett, eyes wide, mouth poised for panic. But he didn't speak. Delilah didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just reached forward, collected the essay Jordan had written, folded it once, and tucked it into her purse. This wasn't about winning. It was about finally being seen. Delilah stood at the base of the staircase, a screwdriver in one hand and a box labeled Final Removals at her feet. The hallway light flickered as she reached up and unscrewed the last of the tiny black surveillance pods Paige had installed. This one tucked discreetly near the hallway crown molding, disguised as a motion sensor. With a soft pop, the device came free. Delilah dropped it into the box with the others. 17 total. A museum of violations. The house breathed easier without them. It was subtle, like taking off a pair of shoes that had been too tight for years. You didn't realize the ache until it eased. She began the renovations with small things. New curtains in the front room, a fresh coat of paint in the kitchen, pale marigold. The color Frank once joked was the sun's second cousin. She removed the decorative signs Paige had hung, live, laugh, love, and replaced them with framed black and white photos. Her own mother smiling beside a 1940s sedan. Baby Emmett asleep in her arms at the hospital. Frank standing on the porch with Jordan clinging to his leg, face sticky with jam. Each photo was chosen like a stitch, a reclamation. One evening, just after supper, there was a knock on the back door. Delilah opened it to find Jordan. He didn't have the swagger he usually wore at family gatherings. No headphones, no phone in hand. Just a boy. Taller now, but quiet, shoulders hunched like someone arriving with unfinished apologies. Hey, he said. Is this a bad time? No, Delilah said. She stepped aside. It's a good time. They sat at the kitchen table. She poured him lemonade. He didn't touch it at first, just looked around at the walls. The old recipe plaques, the faded tea towels, the small shelf now filled with glass jars and memory. This house feels different, he said finally. It is, Delilah replied. It remembers better now. He looked down at his hands. I didn't know. About all of it. I didn't see what was happening. You weren't supposed to, she said gently. They wrote a version of me they needed you to believe. He picked up a framed photo near the counter, Emmett, age 9, holding a baseball glove almost bigger than his chest. I've never seen this one. There's a whole box upstairs, Delilah said. Most of it was in storage. I think it's time they came back home. Jordan hesitated. Can I help? So they went into the pantry and pulled down the old tin box labeled recipe cards. It was dented at one corner, faintly smelling of cinnamon and thyme. Delilah set it on the counter and pulled out a card worn soft at the edges. Apple dumplings, she said. Frank's favorite. She handed him a peeler. They worked in tandem, her chopping, him stirring brown sugar and butter, the radio playing Billie Holiday in the background. Halfway through folding the dough, Jordan said softly, I didn't know. I didn't know you were still holding all this. Delilah didn't flinch. That's the thing about people like me. We hold quietly. It's how we were raised. He nodded, not meeting her eyes. I read your journal, the part you let Mom print out. I think she did it to make you look unwell, but it didn't. It made me feel like a stranger in my own house. Delilah didn't respond with forgiveness. Not yet. She handed him a fork to crimp the edges of the dough. Some repairs begin with silence. That night, after Jordan left with a small tin of dumplings and eyes too full for a 17-year-old, Delilah opened her laptop and typed her first blog post. The title was simple, Still Here. She wrote about the quiet ways women are erased in their own homes, about memory, about how stories get rewritten, not with violence, but omission. She wrote for the women who sat in the corners at family dinners, who were asked to bring food but not opinions, who knew the middle names of everyone's children but weren't asked to share their own. She posted it on a modest blog platform under the heading, Voices from the Kitchen Chair. By morning, 24 comments had appeared. By the end of the week, there were over 100. Nancy was the first subscriber. Gerald left a comment under a pseudonym. You are the sound I never knew I missed. A few days later, Delilah sat with Gerald on her porch swing. The evening light was warm and forgiving, and the hydrangeas she'd planted that spring were finally blooming. He cleared his throat. There's something I need to tell you. She looked over, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. I warned Emmett, Gerald said. Years ago, about Paige. I didn't have proof, just a gut. Saw how she spoke about you when you weren't around. He brushed it off. Delilah didn't speak. He told me to stay out of it. Said I was making things complicated, so I did. She looked away, the swing creaking softly beneath them. I thought silence was safe, Gerald added, but it was cowardice. I should have said more. Delilah reached over and took his hand. We all thought silence was the safest thing. They sat there as the sun dipped low, but the air no longer held the weight of secrets, just the sound of a house learning to breathe again. Delilah smoothed the folded page in her hands, the paper soft from having been handled too many times before the first word was even written. She sat in her sewing room, the air scented faintly of cedar and thread, and stared down at the stationery embossed with tiny pine cones in the corner, something Frank would have found charmingly unnecessary. She began simply, Dear Frank. The words bled slowly, gently, out of her pen. I'm writing this late, I know. Years too late in some ways. But if grief is a season, then I finally found spring. You should know, I didn't fade. I almost did. There were days I felt like wallpaper in my own family, but you would have been proud. I remembered how to fight without raising my voice. I remembered how to belong to myself. She folded the letter neatly, tucked it inside the inner pocket of Frank's old hunting coat, the one still hanging in the back of the closet like it was waiting for October. She buttoned the flap closed and didn't cry. Not because she wasn't moved, but because the ache had finally turned into something cleaner, completion. Later that week, she drove 2 hours north with a basket of lemon bars and a GPS pinned to a memory. The house she'd grown up in wasn't a home anymore. It was a real estate office now, painted beige with a vinyl sign above the porch. The shutters were still crooked. But the tree out front, that same old maple that once held her entire world when she was 10 and grounded, was still there, roots stretching like hands that never stopped holding her. She stepped onto the grass, ignoring the curious look from the receptionist inside, and reached out to touch the bark. It was rough, knotted, familiar. She closed her eyes and leaned in just enough to remember. Clean people don't belong in dirty scenes. Her mother's voice echoed, but this time it didn't sting. It just sounded small. I belonged here, Delilah whispered, more to herself than the wind. That same weekend, Nancy stopped by with a copy of the school's quarterly student feature folded under her arm. You're going to want to read this, she said, grinning. Inside, under the Reflections section, was an article by Jordan M. Brewer. The headline read, The Architect of My Foundation. I once called my grandmother a mascot. I said she was just for show. I didn't realize I was describing the version of her I had been taught to see. The truth is, she's not a relic or a decoration. She's the architect of every brick beneath me. I don't remember every bedtime story, but I remember feeling safe in her house. That kind of safety doesn't come from convenience, it comes from presence. This is my public apology to the woman I watched disappear, and to every elder we learned to stop seeing. Delilah sat on the porch swing, article trembling in her hands, and exhaled. The swing creaked softly, and she didn't notice until a tear dropped on the newsprint, smudging the ink. Not ruin, just evidence. That Tuesday, she stood at a podium in a crowded community center, a microphone clipped too tightly to her collar. The Women's Forum had invited her after her blog gained momentum, and now she faced a sea of faces. Grandmothers, aunts, daughters, caregivers, tired women, quiet women, women who had gone decades without ever being told they mattered. Delilah adjusted her glasses. "We're not supporting characters," she began. "We're the script." The applause started slow, but built like summer rain. Steady, strong, and undeniable. We've spent generations in the background, nodding quietly, folding napkins while other people told our stories. But our silence wasn't consent. It was strategy. And now we write, we speak. We own the rooms they once asked us to decorate. When she stepped down, women stood in line just to hug her. Some handed her notes, others cried. One pressed a small folded napkin into her palm with the words, "You made me feel real again." Later that night, alone in her kitchen, Delilah opened her email to check blog comments and found a new message. From Paige Brewer. Subject: clarification and closure message. Delilah, I realize this situation has escalated beyond what any of us wanted. I'm sorry for any misunderstanding. I hope you'll consider moving forward peacefully. Best, Paige. No warmth, no humility, just polished distance. Delilah didn't hesitate. She hit delete. The sound was soft, satisfying, like shutting a door that had been left ajar for too long. She turned back to the oven, banana bread again. Jordan would be by later to help her label old photo albums. This time, he wanted to ask the questions. And this time, she was ready to answer. The backyard bloomed with late spring defiance, petunias and lavender crowding the borders, wild mint curling near the fence. The folding tables were dressed in white linen, sun catching off crystal pitchers filled with lemonade and wine. Delilah moved barefoot across the grass, soil soft under her heels, holding a faded black and white photo of Frank in one hand and a fresh garden clipping in the other. The sunlight warmed the crown of her head as laughter and conversation swelled behind her. Gerald arrived first, carrying a bottle of red in one hand and a bag of plastic cups in the other. "Thought you might need something a little celebratory," he said, setting it down with a wink. His tie was crooked, shirt too casual, and Delilah wouldn't have wanted it any other way. Nancy came next, trailing her daughter behind her, who held a cake that read, "To New Beginnings" in bright green icing. "It was her idea," Nancy whispered. "She said you've graduated too." By midday, the yard was full. Neighbors, friends from the Women's Forum, readers of the blog. Many had never met Jordan, but all had read about the woman who built her own voice back from silence. Jordan stood near the garden gate, taller now, face clean-shaven and uncharacteristically solemn. His cap tucked under his arm, his shirt untucked. He'd graduated that morning, the official ceremony held 2 towns over. But this was the celebration that mattered. He approached Delilah quietly, almost shyly. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. Delilah smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "You earned it. And besides, I've learned not to wait for someone else to say what should be said." A framed honorary diploma sat on the main table, wrapped in tissue, its seal pressed with deliberate care. It was a replica, not of his real diploma, but one Delilah had made herself, in calligraphy, in honor of lessons passed between generations. Jordan glanced at it, then at her. "Is that for me?" Delilah didn't answer. Not yet. She walked to the front of the yard, raised her hand gently, and the chatter quieted. The moment swelled, not with pomp, but presence. "I want to thank you all for coming," she said, standing barefoot in her own grass, surrounded by the scent of basil and rain-damp soil. "Today we celebrate growth, not just academic but emotional, the kind that takes root late and still blooms." She paused, the honorary diploma in her hand now. "For too long," she continued, "we've equated blood with belonging. But the truth is, family isn't who's in the photos. It's who holds the camera when you're not looking. It's who stays when you're inconvenient, and who listens when you stop being easy to love. She turned slowly, scanning the crowd. Then she beckoned a woman forward, Eleanor, a neighbor in her late 70s. She was quiet, unassuming, always wore scarves no matter the weather. A few people exchanged glances. Eleanor stepped forward uncertainly. Delilah smiled and placed the framed diploma into her hands. For Eleanor, she said clearly, whose grandchildren stop calling, who still bakes cookies for neighbor kids, who knows every birth date on this street, who remembers and still shows up. A hush fell over the crowd, then a single clap, then many. Jordan froze, hands still at his side, unsure if he was embarrassed or enlightened. And then he clapped too. Delilah met his eyes, and there was no shame there, just the echo of something hard-earned, the kind of love that didn't need to prove itself anymore. Later, after the cake was cut and the chairs pushed aside for music, Delilah sat in her garden with the old photo of Frank. She traced the edges with one thumb, then tucked it beside the new hydrangeas. The earth welcomed it. Inside, the house smelled of lemon and ink. Delilah sat at her desk, barefoot, deliberate, and opened a fresh Word document. At the top, she typed the title in bold, centered font, not just a placeholder. Then, the first line, "Being born into a family isn't the same as belonging in one." And Delilah wrote, "If this story stirred something quiet and familiar in you, don't walk away from it. Sit with it. Ask who in your life has been quietly fading while holding everything together. Then do what this story did. Unfade them. Because some truths aren't just told, they're finally heard."